Welcome back to the Global Mental Health and Wellbeing Summit. I'm Cassandra Beaton, and I am so excited to be here with Dr. Thema Bryant. Dr. Thema is a clinical psychologist and a professor of psychology at Pepperdine University, as well as an ordained minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Dr. Thema earned her doctorate from Duke University and completed her postdoctoral training at Harvard Medical School. With more than 20 years of experience in trauma recovery, she's appeared as a mental health expert on television, radio, and in print. Dr. Thema raises awareness about mental health issues on her Homecoming podcast and her social media platforms. She's also the author of the book Homecoming: Overcome Fear and Trauma to Reclaim Your Whole Authentic Self. Hello, Dr. Thema. It's so wonderful to be with you today.
Oh, hello. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm honored and excited to be here.
Oh, it's just so great to have you here. So I just want to dive right in. You have released this relatively new book, Homecoming, and I just wanted to see if you could share a few of the key points from it and what inspired you to write it.
Yes. Well, I am both a trauma survivor and a trauma psychologist, and I wrote Homecoming in the midst of the pandemic, which is a form of a trauma. So there was so much that was going on around us and as a result within us, and the need was so great. My practice became full. Most of the practitioners who I am friends with and familiar with were saying the same thing. And so I felt it was really important to try to get a resource out, a self-help book, and also much of my prior scholarship was for the academy. You know, it's used in textbooks and read by persons in the field, which means it has a lot of jargon in it. And so really wanting to give back and to create a resource that would be accessible, both in language and in cost. When we publish these academic books, they're pretty expensive. And so it was wonderful to have both a book and an audio book that's $20. So most people can get it or even check it out of the library. And the concept behind Homecoming is that trauma disconnects us from ourselves. So we can feel like we're going through the motions, or we're just doing what we need to do to survive, or doing what we can do to please and appease others, but have been disrupted in terms of the sense of ourselves. And so Homecoming is then that healing journey to reclaim yourself, physically, emotionally, spiritually, socially. And I talk about that healing as reclaiming your whole authentic self. Mm-hmm. And so many times we are wounded, we have symptoms, and people can meet our symptoms or our wounds, and they haven't really met us. They have met the parts of us that are still reacting to the trauma. Mm-hmm. And so for us to remember, a phrase I often say to clients is trauma affects you, but it doesn't define you. So my authentic self is more than my trauma. There's a deeper part of who I am.
Say a little more about the authentic self. I've had a long background. When I did my clinical training, I did a lot of work in early transpersonal psychology and Gestalt and things like that. And it seems like since then, the focus in psychology has moved so much more towards sort of a symptom reduction medical model. People aren't talking about as much about this authenticity. Can you say more about it?
And I appreciate that framing, because I think it's really important for practitioners to consider, and also researchers to think about what we provide beyond symptom cessation. So symptom cessation is important, but that's not the end of the story. So a person may no longer have suicidal ideation, but still have no joy. They may have stopped cutting, but still have no sense of peace or purpose. And so whether we think about these principles as related to community psychology or positive psychology or holistic psychology, for us to be mindful, decreasing distress is an important part of the process, but that's not the complete process. And so then it is about helping people to be empowered to claim themselves and to show up as themselves. And as I name that, it's important to also think about not only interpersonal trauma, but what some have called the trauma of oppression and the way that can cause us to disconnect from ourselves. So women are often pressured to perform in some ways, these ideas of ideal womanhood, and how that should show up both in our family life and also in our professional life. People of color often are battling stereotypes, and so can feel they have to conform or contort themselves in particular ways to be deemed safe or acceptable. And so it was one of the best affirmations I received after winning the election for the American Psychological Association. Was a group of psychologists who are people of color invited me for a Zoom meeting. And their first question was, how did you manage to do it while being so authentic? And I think it's an important question, but also the heaviness of the question is the assumption, right, that in order for us to thrive or succeed, we must leave ourselves behind and be some other kind of person. And so it is really important for me that if we say wholeness, wellness, that is based in authenticity, not performance.
I love that. And yeah, I just got chills as you were talking, as your voice as a Black woman and your presence is becoming stronger and stronger in the field of psychology. It's not just you, it's symbolic. And it gives me some faith in humanity that we are moving in the right direction. So I sure appreciate you saying yes to the offer. It's really appreciated because I know it's a lot,
Thank you. Thank you so
that
much.
Ongoing triggering, that ongoing, these moments where people feel thrown into survival mode. And it can happen from something big, like something that happens in one's family or something that they see on TV or something, even just a look, even just one of those minor things, that we think are minor, but they're not.
Yeah.
And when someone's thrown into survival mode, how is it that they can recognize it? And what is the evolution out of survival mode? What's the next step they can take?
Yeah. So, first I would say us honoring the ways we survived. I saw this documentary and they had different groups talking. And in one of the groups, they were Jewish Americans. And one of them said, the ways we have survived have not always been beautiful, but we survived, right? And I want to name that because sometimes we're so hard on ourselves of what we did to make it. And while it is true, I don't want to have to stay stuck in that mode. I do want to appreciate myself for making it. I am mindful of a survivor I worked with who her father, or actually her mother's boyfriend, was molesting her. And she discovered if she was awake when he came in her room, he would leave. He wouldn't do it. And so she developed the capacity. At night, she would just stand against the wall to stay up all night, right? Which, of course, then she would go to school and be tired and get bad grades, and the teachers would complain. But as she's telling it to me, how remarkable, how brilliant, that you figured out something to keep yourself safe. And yes, you didn't have the best of grades, and, the teachers had labeled you in this particular way, but, you made it. And so I think for each of us in various ways, we can hold shame or judgment against ourselves, and sometimes in very harsh ways. And so inviting in that tenderness and appreciation of this is how I made it. And then after that acknowledgement, when I can also then say, what has it cost me? Because sometimes, as opposed to being ashamed of it, sometimes people embrace it and celebrate it and take it on. Mm-hmm. So those are clients or other individuals who may say things like, I don't need any friends, right? So it becomes like a badge of honor, this kind of hyper individualism, right? Of the way I survived was not trusting people, but now I am holding on to that as, a trophy. And so yes, that if you don't let anybody in, it definitely does increase your safety to some level. But then let's think about, what has it cost me to hold on to this? What has this style or this mindset, what has it robbed me of? And that's going to be important when we consider things like motivational interviewing, right? Why would I give it up if it's my security? And it's the only reason I would give it up is if it has cost me too much, and if there's another way, and I believe that other way is accessible to me. So then there's the psychoeducation of, learning another way. As I say that, I'm, mindful of someone else who, kind of his strategy was going from 1 to 10. So he'd be super calm, the slightest disrespect, and he would be, to the ceiling. And his kind of defense of it was, that's how his father was. And he noticed like no one in the community ever messed with his father because he was known for like doing that. Well, okay, there are benefits to that. And now let's look at, how is it affecting your marriage? Would have been the cost of doing that at your job, right? And to know there's another way that doesn't mean now you're weak or powerless or helpless. We have those false dichotomies. So I would say to come out of survival mode, to recognize its costs, to recognize its initial function. And when I recognize its initial function, it immediately helps me to start to consider it is not my identity. It is just the way I learned to survive, because people aren't willing to let it go when they think that is them. Yeah. And often the trauma happens so early, people have taken on these characteristics very early. So it becomes, that's me. And they'll say, that's my authentic self. Yeah. And it's like, is that really your authentic self? Or did you never get to play, right? Did you never get to learn what ease felt like? So you kind of grew up as a little warrior. But that little warrior is not your authentic self. It's who you had to be to survive your house or your community. And so that invitation and education, because I think sometimes, depending on your theoretical orientation, there can be the assumption that everything people need to know, they already know. And it's just not true. Like some people have never thought of another possibility, have never seen that. And even if they've seen it, don't know how to do it. So then being able to practice it.
Yeah, it's beautiful. As you know, this whole summit is based on expanding our approaches to mental health. And you mentioned the word play, and I've been doing this for 20 years and have been trying to bring some of these extended practices into the domain. And, people will tell me, are you kidding? I can't bring some kind of artistic expression into my center. We can barely keep the beds full. We can barely feed folks. We got to get them out of being suicidal. We got to deal with their addictions. We got to get them jobs. All of this is so important, and what you're talking about is like a cherry on top of a sundae that doesn't even exist. And I've been making the point, it's not the cherry on top of the sundae. This is actually building the foundation upon which people can build getting a job and being able to self-regulate in these things. So I just wanted to see if you could comment on the work done on artistic expression and creativity and play in mental health.
Right. I'm so glad you raised this example, and also people's pushback, which is, largely based in being stretched thin and not having enough resources. So I get that. So I think as a field, those of us who have done research and education and practice using the expressive arts and other modalities have not always done a good job of educating others. So people don't know what we are doing and the ways in which it is serving the the goals, right? Serving the goals of the center, serving the treatment goals. And as you were talking, I thought of an example. One of my aunts is a school teacher, and she was complaining to me that she had a kid in her class who was misbehaving a lot. And the school counselor, when she would send the kid to the office, she said the school counselor would just let him color pictures, paint pictures, and then send him back. Now, in her mind, she was thinking of as both frivolous and a reward. He's bad, and then he gets to go color, right? So I had to explain about the ways in which art is therapy, right? That it's not just that he's having a good time, but self-expression, regulating your emotions. And so whatever goals that we have for people, whether adults or children, there are multiple pathways to get there. And I think we often hold up the model of like handouts, right? But that goes against our science of people having multiple learning styles, different learning styles. And so for some people, I give them a handout and they love it. They hold on to it. They give it to all their family and friends and educate them in that way. And some people really don't take in information that way. And so it's for us to have a fuller menu, a fuller toolkit. And I want to also name some of the people who grab hold of the handout are really used to intellectualizing and rationalizing. So they're very much in their heads, not in their bodies. There's no connection. So they can recite back to you what you've said, and they know it will please us that they're saying our language. But then you wonder about how come each week it's the same behavior, that there's no change. It hasn't translated from reciting it to living it. And it's because it's not yet embodied.
It's so true. And I tend to be someone who lives up here. And I remember about 10 years ago, I started doing something called 5 Rhythms Dance. And I know you've been into dance. And when I started to live below my neck and recognize how unfamiliar I was with that territory, and yet how much it was defining both my strengths and my insecurities. And, I probably danced in practice for a year before I stopped wondering what I looked like and just fell into my body and started to dance without worrying what I looked like. And then that rippled out into the rest of my life. Yeah. Tell me a little bit more about your work in the domain of dance.
Yes. I love you naming that and talking about how I think many of us who end up in these professions and other professions are, very head oriented, and we can be rewarded for that, but have left our bodies behind. And so I would say as simple an embodied practice of inviting those who are watching now to check in with your body to see, are you actually comfortable? Like any adjustment that you need to make. If you want to stand up and stretch, if you want to grab some water, I have water, whatever we need to do, because we suppress our physical needs and make our bodies perform, right? Or make them be still, which is that whole training in our school system, right? Is like sit still, don't wiggle, don't move. And so, we have been trained to do that. Just sit in your cubicle, right? And, don't make noise and don't move your body. And so for me, dance was very, very healing. I mentioned in the beginning that I'm a trauma survivor and different forms of trauma, but one of them was sexual assault. And I strongly believe one of the reasons why I didn't develop a hatred for my body was because I was a dancer. So my experience of my physical self was not just about what had been done to me. Mm-hmm. It's like this was my vehicle for expression. And long before I told people using words, I had already danced about it, right? And that was freeing and liberating, and helped me to know that I belong to myself, that I'm a home for me. And so I have used it with survivors of diverse forms, because the honest piece, whether you're a trauma survivor or not, and I say this even as a poet and someone who loves words, there are some things that words don't capture.
Yeah.
Is right. It doesn't. No matter how great your vocabulary is, there are just some parts of the human experience where even if I said it to you, it wouldn't convey it. And so to be able to integrate the body is a beautiful resource. And also, one of the things we know about trauma is trauma disrupts the nervous system. So if our intervention is only cognitive, if I'm only focused on changing your thoughts, then I have not yet dealt with you as a holistic being.
So beautiful. Yeah, exactly. I worked with the unsheltered in a project maybe, oh gosh, I want to say 18 years ago now. And we called the program At Home Within. And it was really trying to do exactly what you said, which is that, regardless of when and whether you have a home externally, you've got to have some semblance of a home internally. And that often doesn't come through the thinking mind. It comes through feeling at home in your body, at home in your spirit, at home in your emotions. And so we did practices like mindfulness and meditation. And one in particular was called Yoga Nidra, which is called I Rest now, which is an embodied form of meditation. And I mean, we had people coming back in saying, I slept through the night for the first night in 20 years. My back pain went away for 2 hours while I was doing it. It's the first time I haven't felt that pain in 10 years. It was just incredible. And so much of what we're addressing here is not in the realm of the thinking mind. Now, it's important. The thinking mind is important, and it is a big part of what drives our success and what kind of tortures us if you're the type of person like me and others that have, really loud minds. And, so, I think these practices are more than icing on the cake. They're more than the cherry on top of the sundae. In fact, they're foundational, fundamental practices, which is why they're embedded in so many religions and spiritual traditions. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the connection between your spirituality and your work in psychology, if there is one.
Yes, I love the question. And there are a couple of different terms. Some people have used the construct indigenizing psychology.
Love that.
And a part of that is us recognizing the healing strategies, some may say medicines, that come from our cultural and or faith traditions, that psychology as a field doesn't have a monopoly on healing practices. They come to us in all different ways. Sometimes they've been taken over by psychologists without really giving them credit or acknowledging the source, whether it's the racial, ethnic, cultural source or religious, spiritual source that they come from. And so, the example I love to give for this one is there's a lot of research now on the vagus nerve, especially around trauma and anxiety and kind of self-calming, self-regulating practices. And, researchers have found, along with encouraging people to take breath, one of the great ways to regulate the nervous system, two of the great ways are humming and rocking. Yes. And if you go to any Black church in America, that is what you're going to see is people humming and rocking, right? Without having done a study with 100,000 participants. And so, that's the tradition I grew up in. Or, we say mindfulness or stillfulness, the common phrase with grandmothers, was sit down somewhere, right? You just need to be still in that sacred sense. There's a song in my faith tradition called Sweet Hour of Prayer. And this notion of flowing all the way down, right? As opposed to from that anxiety place of God help me, but really being present, right? So there is much wisdom that we can learn from our various traditions. And they have been so important to me. What researchers have found is on average, mental health providers endorse a lower level of religiosity than the general public. So what does that mean? It means you have largely people without a faith creating the healing models for people of faith. And so what does that translate to? That faith is often left out. Mm-hmm. And people will say, well, I don't want to get into that. Meanwhile, if the person you're working with, if that is central to their meaning making, to their identity, to the ways in which they cope and heal, then you don't actually know that client. And it goes against our ethical guidelines that, ethically, when we are to tune into culture, that's not only gender, sexuality, race, socioeconomic status, it's also people's religion and spirituality in a respectful way. And you don't have to have the same religion to be respectful, mm-hmm. but some people are dismissive because it's either out of their lived experience, they've had no experience, or they had a harmful experience. Mm-hmm. And it's so important for anyone who is a provider to hold both truths. Mm-hmm. And one truth is religion and spirituality has been a source of strength and a protective factor for many people. And religion and spirituality has been utilized to abuse and control and demean some people. So both of those things coexist, and some people are only willing to acknowledge one or the other based on their lived experience. Mm-hmm. And so it is very important, and a part of my work is being a bridge between the communities. I think many times people will highlight the fact that people of faith can be dismissive of mental health. But as a profession, we often don't want to own our part, that people of our profession have said and done some harmful things that have made people of faith not trust these systems, quote unquote, of care, right? And, I'll just give one example. So I grew up as a pastor's daughter. So I grew up going to church, right? It was just something we did, and something I enjoyed doing because all my friends were there and we had the choir and all kinds of fun activities. But I think I was in graduate school or a postdoc the first time I heard this term hyper-religiosity, mm-hmm. right? And I asked well, what is that? And the client's family was going to church 2 or 3 times a week. Mm. Well, if you grew up never going at all, that sounds extreme. Yeah. But if you grow up in it, then Wednesday might be a prayer meeting, and Friday might be youth night, and then Sunday is this regular service for everybody. So that's when I really became aware of how subjective it is, and how people, based on their own either lack of knowledge or woundedness, can pathologize people for something that actually may be very healthy for them.
Yeah. And there's so much data now showing that, people, the vast majority of people, we're talking 80 to 90%. There has been a deep move towards secularization, but still 80 to 90% of people believe in God. People will say it's the number one orienting principle of their entire lives. Mm-hmm. Mental health patients will often say it's one of their top coping mechanisms is their spirituality or prayer, something like that. And as you say, many people will say it's a source of pain and trauma for them. And as you know, I'm involved in a large-scale effort to bring religious and spiritual competency training guidelines to across mental health professions. And the good news is we really haven't encountered a lot of pushback. We thought we'd really be climbing a big hill, and that a lot of people would say this is contaminating our scientific psychology and its spirit, it's superstitious and all this stuff. So I'm really happy that it seems like it's ringing true for people. And it's in part because we also see the downside, that so many mass shootings are religiously motivated, or I'd say perversion of religion motivated. And so it's starting just to become very clear that it's a huge part of people's lives, a huge part of people's diversity. Right. And primarily on the strength side, that's what the research shows. And although there's a small minority of people who have a really, really, really hard time with it. And at the upcoming APA convention, we're also looking at intersectionality, where we're doing a collaborative panel with the people who are coming from the LGBTQ diversity part, and then the religious and spiritual diversity part, and saying, okay, look, we really hurt you. What are we going to do about this? How are we going to honor each other as we see our clients more completely.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so I wondered if, you have this awesome podcast, and I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about it and let me know if there's anything that's been a highlight or anything surprising, or if you just want to tell people about what the goal of the podcast is.
Yeah. So the podcast was really this way of disseminating knowledge. We know knowledge is power, and, psychological knowledge and psychological science shouldn't just be for the elite or the wealthy or the highly educated or people who had journal access. But, if we invest all of this time and money in conducting these studies, and then only a handful of people read them, it's, what was the point of that, right? What was the purpose of that? So the Homecoming podcast is a mental health podcast that's meant for the general public. And they're about 30-minute episodes on average. And I talk about a particular construct, whether it's shame or resentment or forgiveness, depression, anxiety, COVID, all of the different pieces and challenges that we face. And, the podcast has, we receive requests, or I receive requests from people. They'll email and say, can you, do an episode on this particular topic? So the beautiful thing that I was not expecting was the global reach. And this is, I'm someone who loves global psychology, but just when I put it, on the internet, I really had not considered how far it would go. And I mean, there are more people listening in Johannesburg than in South Africa than in some cities in the US. And then, at least I've been to South Africa before, but then there are a bunch of countries I've never been to, and they have responded so positively to it. And, people write me, and it's just really remarkable. And I'm one of those people that don't have like some complex studio arrangement. It's literally me in my bedroom recording.
I love it. Yes.
So for it to be, done kind of in my own sphere. And so the ways in which it has traveled and people have connected to it have been such a gift. And I will also say that the podcast is what opened the door for my book.
Oh, yeah.
So the publishers reached out to me, and with the podcast, I don't have sponsors. So I do it out of, my heart to do it. And the, idea came to me to do it. And so out of that inspiration, just following through. And so both the reach to people and the impact on people's lives, and then also it's then opened other doors for me to be able to share this information.
It's so great. It's, like the democratization of psychology and these concepts. And I kind of love that you do it from your living room. This is a gift that COVID has given us, that we can do these things. And I mean, I'm sitting in a kitchen right now, and we're going to reach hundreds of thousands of people. And it just feels, it's kind of back to that authenticity. It's like we're kind of going back to real people reaching out to other real people with real talk and honesty, and just speaking the truth, and, exploring ideas together across nations. It's just amazing. So, and I love that about the kids now too. I mean, if, there's a lot of problems with social media, no question, but there are also a lot of people talking openly about their trauma and their symptoms and their strength, and, girls talking about loving their curvy bodies, and girls talking about having anxiety and walking through it anyway. And, there's just that upside, I think, to what's happening in social media right now. What do you think about it?
Oh, I love it. And I think in terms of, some of the harmful things, it's about curating your page, right? Mm-hmm. Curating your feed of when I, go on to check in with myself about how I feel when I get off. If I get off feeling like I'm, ugly, I'm not enough, I'm insufficient, I'm inadequate, then I'm following the wrong pages, right? And I'm following the Instagram models or whatever it is that is convincing me of my unworthiness. But if you follow people and pages that either give you humor, that give you new information, inspiration, where you can see reflections of yourself in them, then, it really can give people a sense of community. Mm-hmm. And some people are in places where they feel very isolated or like no one gets them. And then they go online and have like all of these friends. I saw something really sweet yesterday where a guy who maybe has a little bigger following was videotaping his sister and saying he feels bad because she every day does these like videos, and she had her light set up. She was doing the whole thing. And he was saying, and she doesn't have any subscribers. So then people asked like for her profile, and then all of his friends like followed her. And so she was then overwhelmed. So it can be a way of, finding people, finding affirmation and support. And while there are people who will get online and say very mean things, there are also people who are so affirming. I saw this exchange. I want to say it was on TikTok or Instagram, but a young lady was discouraged because she had worked really hard and applied to these top colleges and didn't get in anywhere. So she was devastated and was just packing up all her books like none of it mattered. And people just flooded her comments telling her, how proud she should be and how she could try again next semester. So it was really beautiful.
That's great. I love it. Yeah. I love that curation and checking in with yourself afterwards to find out how do you feel and who are you following? What are you looking at? That's great. There's kind of a media literacy there. Well, we got to wrap up. I could talk to you all day long. But I wanted to say that, you did a TEDx talk about a lot of what we're talking about. You mentioned 7 medicines, and I don't think we should go into them all right now because you can go see Dr. Thema's TED Talk. But can you leave us with just a few core practices that people can do if they're walking through a hard time? What are a few of the medicines, a few of the practices that people can do today to help themselves, to work with their families, with their neighbors and communities?
Yeah. So the first medicine is truth telling. It is necessary to acknowledge our wounds in order to heal. And many of us are so caught up in that script of how are you? I'm fine. How are you? Right? That we never have room to not only tell other people the truth, but even ourselves. So to be honest with yourself and those you trust about the ways you have been impacted, affected by the various things in your life. That is, the first principle. The second one is giving yourself permission to feel your feelings and to know you can feel more than one thing at the same time. So we want to get away from toxic positivity or toxic religiosity or spirituality where you have to just be grateful and upbeat all the time, or you're not a real spiritual person, or you're not a good person. And that just goes against, the teachings, I think, of every major and probably minor faith tradition as well. For us to give ourselves compassion, that I can be grateful for the good things in my life and still be disappointed that some things didn't work out, or I can have love for, some people in my life and also be angry or upset or regret. So to give ourselves the permission to be full human beings, about how you actually feel and the various layers of that. And thinking about from your own socialization, the ways you were raised, what emotions were acceptable and which things were not acceptable. I was talking to 2 different people who were saying they have a hard time on job interviews, because on job interviews, they kind of want you to praise yourself, but they were raised to you never say something good about yourself. So it has cost them, right? If people are like, why should you get this job? And they'll say something like, well, I try really hard. Well, but if you looked at their resume or, they've done a number of remarkable things. So what are the ways that sometimes the way I was taught may be getting in the way and it doesn't mean I have to then turn into like this arrogant person who's always talking about myself, but are there any ways it doesn't serve me? And then the last one I'll mention is on two sides of the same coin, which is self-care and community care. And so doing things to nourish yourself, and then relationships and community are important. And so it doesn't take a whole bunch of people, but like a few, or there are a handful of people. And if I don't have that, to consider making it a goal for myself to cultivate, foster deeper, mutual, reciprocal relationships, because those are really important for our wholeness and wellness, and they make life richer.
Oh, so beautifully said. Well, I sure appreciate you taking the time, Dr. Thema, and I'm so inspired by you and everything you've said and what you're doing and where you're going. So thanks for being here. And I really invite everybody to check out the Homecoming book, the Homecoming podcast, Dr. Thema's TEDx talk, and to follow her on social media, because you're going to be able to learn quite a lot as the years unfold. Thank you so much from my heart.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a wonderful conversation.